Number 10. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected as the first Republican president. To this day, the Republican Party remains one of the two major political parties in the United States, with 19 of the 45 presidents being Republicans. For about 40% of presidential history, a Republican has occupied the White House. Number 9. Lincoln is the undisputed tallest president, standing at 6 feet 4 inches, which is 5 inches taller than the average president's height of 5 feet 11 inches. After Lincoln is Lyndon Johnson at 6 feet 3.5 inches, then Donald Trump at 6 feet 3 inches. While height is generally seen as an advantage for presidential candidates, Lincoln was so tall and awkwardly proportioned that he was ridiculed for his appearance. He usually played it off with self-deprecating humor. Number 8. Like many presidents of the era, Lincoln grew up in poverty. He grew up in log cabins. One of these cabins was only 16 feet by 18 feet with a dirt floor. Lincoln started working tedious and strenuous manual labor at just 8 years old. He only received about 12 months of formal education and was almost entirely self-educated. Whenever possible, he would take breaks from his work to read. His jobs included rail splitter, carpenter, blacksmith, land surveyor, and store clerk, until at age 25 he achieved his law license. Number 7. Though Lincoln is known as the Great Emancipator, he was actually much more moderate on the issue of slavery through most of his political career. He denounced abolitionists as radicals who indirectly made slavery more cruel, and he merely called for restricting slavery's expansion into new territories. Lincoln always hated slavery and wanted its eventual abolition, but he was also a firm believer in the rule of law. Also, through most of his political career, he simply didn't see calls for immediate abolition as politically pragmatic. Number 6. Lincoln filled his cabinet with political rivals who he'd fought against for the 1860 Republican nomination. The former rivals included Secretary of State William Seward, Secretary of the Treasury Salmon Chase, Secretary of War Simon Cameron, and Attorney General Edward Bates. His cabinet was diversified with more radical and moderate Republicans. Number 5. There are no recordings of Abraham Lincoln's voice, but based on descriptions, he didn't have the booming baritone voice that many today associate with him. One journalist of the time described his voice as, quote, a thin tenor, or rather falsetto voice, almost as high-pitched as a bosun's whistle. Some people even described his voice as annoying. Nevertheless, it carried far, which served him well in speeches and debates. Number 4. 44th President Barack Obama cited Abraham Lincoln as his favorite president. Obama felt a connection on a professional level, as they were both lawyers based out of Illinois and politicians, but also, as an African American, he felt a personal connection. Quote, I feel a special gratitude to the singular figure who in so many ways made my own story possible. For his inauguration, Obama used the same Bible Lincoln used, and during his presidency, a portrait of Lincoln hung in the Oval Office. Number 3. A bizarre irony of the Civil War was that both Abraham Lincoln and Confederate President Jefferson Davis were born in Kentucky, though neither spent much of their lives there. Kentucky was a southern border state during the war. 40% of the fighting population fought for the Confederacy and 60% for the Union. Number 2. Lincoln's private life was marred in tragedy. Of his 4 children, only the eldest, Robert, lived to maturity. Eddie, born in 1846, died only 3 years later. During the first year of Lincoln's presidency, his third son, Willie, died at age 11. The youngest, Tad, died of heart failure only 6 years after the assassination of his father. Lincoln's wife, Mary, was prone to depression and erratic behavior, which grew increasingly worse as she faced more tragedies. Robert eventually had her institutionalized. Number 1. Lincoln is featured on both the $5 bill and the penny. Like Washington and Jefferson, he appears on both a banknote and a coin. His portrait first showed up on the penny in 1909, and it was the first time a president's portrait was used on coinage. Americans had traditionally been against using presidential portraits on coinage, but the overwhelming sentimentality towards Lincoln